Hello and welcome. I think we're still waiting for Flora, which my understanding is she's having her machine restoring, and so machine issues. So I guess I'll just try to kick this off. This is a bit unexpected. Um, so hi everyone, welcome to Contributing Today. Today we'll be chatting about funding open source projects and sponsoring open source. So my name is Toby, and today I'm co-hosting this meetup with Floor. Um, and I'm trying to jump through the notes here. Yes, so the first thing I think is important to mention is that we have a code of conduct that you can read in its entirety on our website at https contributing.today. In short, please let's be kind to one another, and we appreciate that we're all here to learn and contribute. If you notice anything unsavory, please bring it up with one of the contact peeps listed. You can find the recordings of previous Contributing Today meetups like on Python, Go, TypeScript, open source docs, and other topics via Contributing.Today as well. If you're on the Twitters, feel free to share with friends and also with strangers that you're watching this meetup and use the #ContributingToday hashtag. My co-host today is going to be Flora. She'll be joining us any minute now, and so I'll introduce myself to get started. So I'm originally a front-end developer. I got involved with open source really early on in my career, and that's sort of like dating me at this point, was the prototype JavaScript library, which was the big thing before jQuery, which was a big thing. So this is like a really long time ago. I then sort of focused on web standards, and I'm now back focusing on open source as a consultant, so more helping companies make sense of it. And the topic of open source sustainability and essentially funding and sponsoring open source is something that has been really dear to my heart for a long time. I've written about it a number of times. I've spoken about it really frequently, and so I'm really happy that today we're going to be able to dig into funding and sponsoring open source a bit more deeply. So I don't know if Flora is about to join us or not. I see a spinning death wheel right next to me. So I think I'm just going to start introducing some of our guests. So the first guest that we have is Emma Irwin. Hello, Irma. Welcome. So Emma, you are a senior PM on the Microsoft OSPO, so that stands for Open Source Programs Office. And amongst other things, you're responsible for the Microsoft FUS Fund that is awarded monthly. And I think this is one of the reasons why one of the topics that we'll be talking about today. Next, I will want to welcome Penelope Fippen. I'm not sure if I'm butchering your last name.
No, you got
okay?
it. You got it completely
Wonderful.
right.
Because I was not prepared to be introducing you, so I didn't practice that. So you are based in New York. You work as a software engineer at Stripe, and you were previously a developer advocate at Google, and had a swath of roles at DigitalOcean. You are also the director of Ruby Central.
Director of Ruby Central.
Oh, sorry. A director of Ruby. Yeah, it's an important distinction. Thank you. Next, I will want to welcome Henry Tsu. So Henry is also based in New York. Henry, you are, hello and welcome. You are a full-time maintainer of Babel, which is a community-funded compiler for JavaScript. Previously, you worked at Adobe, and you host notably two podcasts, one called Open Source and the other one called Maintainers Anonymous. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jory joining us, Jory Burson. Jory is a consultant and educator that I've worked with on various occasions. You are working to improve collaboration in open source and open standards communities as a member of several industry boards and standard-setting organizations, also known as SDOs, among which the among which the OpenJS Foundation Cross-Project Council, the W3C, Open Web Docs, which I'm hoping we'll hear a lot more about today, and multiple others. And finally, we are welcoming Chris Anichik. Chris, you are the CTO of the Linux Foundation. Hello and welcome. You are focused on the CNCF, OCI, and also the To-Do group. You're also a partner at Capital Factory for open source and infrastructure-focused startups. And you were heading Twitter's OSPO a long time ago. That's when we actually first met. And you're actually now back on the board of the Eclipse Foundation too. Floor, welcome.
I made it.
I can't believe that. Me too.
Oh my gosh. I see that. Toby, I'm so sorry.
That is perfectly fine.
Did you get a chance to talk about all the house rules, or do you want me to quickly do that?
No, so I did touch on the code of conduct briefly.
Well, that's pretty good because that's very important.
Right, which is why I touched on it. Spoke about it, not touched on it. What happened the previous weeks and all of that, given that I don't really know about this, I didn't speak to. So if you could do that, I also did not introduce you. So, please go ahead and take it from here.
And that's perfectly fine, and I hope that the panelists will indulge me while I talk about the boring stuff. So also from my end, welcome to Contributing.Today. My name is Flora, and I'm one of the co-organizers for this group. And usually connecting, goes really well, unless you're hosting yourself. They're allowing me on stream for once, and then this happens. Anyway, I hope that doesn't have further implications for me not being on stream ever again. But previous weeks, you might have found me in the Discord chat where I am, having convos with y'all. And I hope that everybody will participate in the chat, either to the right of this screen, and I'm not going to point because I point in the wrong direction, or on the Discord server itself. Today, Nick will be taking care of all of your questions and your nuggets of wisdom. We have a code of conduct. Toby mentioned that. That's great. You can also find it on Contributing.Today if you need to read it once more. And you can find recordings of previous Contributing Today meetups, like on Python or Go or TypeScript or open source documentation tools or anything you can think about on Contributing.Today as well. And if you're on Twitter, feel free to share it with friends and strangers that you're watching this meetup and maybe participating in it a little bit using the Contributing Today hashtag. Done. I'm done.
Wonderful. Do you want to give a bit more context to this conversation and why this came
100%. Yes, exactly. So a couple of meetups back, we had a topic on open source documentation, and one of the coordinators, we got to talk about open source funding with one of the coordinators for a project in that sort of space. And we were thinking about nominating, and when I say we, I mean me and one of my colleagues at Microsoft, to nominate this project for the Microsoft Fuzz Fund to see if they can get some more support for a really good cause. And while we were going through the nomination process, we had a lot of questions about what does it actually mean to get such a capital injection? What would they expect to spend money on? Maybe is that even is that important in the due diligence on the side of Microsoft for them to maybe decide on granting them or even make them eligible for nomination? And really, we got curious about what sustainable open source funding or sponsoring looks like. And that's why we're here today to talk about what that potentially looks like and what different funding or sponsor mechanisms there are. And if they're not perfect, which maybe they might not be, what is needed to improve those.
Wonderful. So why don't we maybe start asking Emma if you can maybe speak a bit to the Microsoft FOSS Fund, so people understand a bit better what it does. I think that would be a great start.
Yeah, so great. So the Microsoft's FOSS Fund is actually one of a few different FOSS funds that are out there that organizations are running. So Indeed is one, Salesforce is another, and we're sort of sharing this model for, that really is an experimentation, but how can we, fund open source projects, raise awareness of use internally. So, it's the multifaceted educational piece as well. And as part of that, encourage contribution to open source. So the FOSS Fund is at Microsoft we're in our 9th round. So we run these monthly. We award $10,000 to the most voted on project, as determined by people who work at Microsoft who have contributed to open source. So you have to qualify to vote, you must have contributed to open source. We're trying to scale the impact both through the fund itself and also by encouraging people to contribute as a part of participation. So yeah, that's the FOSS Fund so far.
Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the questions that you ask? Because I went through the process of nominating a project. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so we do a call for nominations. Like it's open daily, so we try not to create any boundaries around when someone can nominate a project. If it occurs to somebody that in the moment that their software that they're using that's really important, there's a place they can go and make sure that gets on the radar for the monthly FOSS Fund. We ask a number of questions, but they're meant to they're not meant to be prohibitive or limit who can be nominated. Rather, it's just like, do you know which license? Is this an open source license? Is there an active community working around this project? Is there a code of conduct, right? Are you thinking about inclusive and healthy communities? Or is this project thinking about inclusive and healthy communities? We ask people to pitch, why would people want to vote and fund this project? And to just describe the impact that they think that the funds might have. None of these questions, especially the last one around how this might help the project, are criteria for voting. It's just more to make sure that the nominator really understands and has a vision for how we can impact that project. So the nominators come along, enter this information, and then we run the actual election once a month. And so an automated email will go out to everyone that's contributed to open source in the last month. They'll be given that list of project nominees, a description, the pitch from the person nominating, and a vote button. So it's pretty awesome. And we are, and even if a project isn't selected, we try and bring back projects who've been runners up. We really try and make sure that we help those projects as much as possible.
I feel like that's an action item for me now.
Yeah. No, I'm going to
didn't make it.
Yeah.
So
we've done the runner-up roundup. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would like to sort of ask Henry, who's on the receiving end of funds like this, to sort of maybe tell a bit of Henry, the story on your side, what it feels like, what it looks like to be essentially trying to run an open source project full time and trying to get it funded through similar funds of that nature. Sort of how do you manage the looking for funds time in relationship to actually working on the project time? And I think having your perspective here would be really useful.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of hard to even, I guess, talk about, because I guess, the way everyone does it can be different. Something I think about, this is maybe too philosophical, but phenomenology of doing open source, what does it feel like on the inside of receiving it versus just I think, you don't know how people are going to want to spend money or what they're expecting. And so, I've had discussions with people where when I say, or if anyone says they're going to do open source full time or just do open source, what do they mean by that? And that can encompass a lot of different, I guess, activities that might not be code. And so if you look at my GitHub, maybe there isn't as much code as you might expect for someone that says they're doing open source, because maybe we think that the only thing that you can do is have some GitHub, in the background right now, there's a bunch of GitHub green squares, and that says a lot about who I am and my value. And so I feel bad about that too. It's I want to spend my time writing code too, but then I realized that almost in some weird way, the more time I spend writing code, that's not actually going to lead to any funding at all, because there might be like this psychological thing where like, oh, well, we're okay with working on it anyway, or we don't need enough money. Say we're okay with a certain amount just because like my standard of living is lower, then they might not give money anymore. And so there's all these like weird, I guess, incentives and just like feelings around like doing donations. I know Chris had like a post about like the gig economy. I do agree with that. Like what I'm doing isn't really a real like business model. I agree with that. I don't think it's really necessarily going to work out, other than just like a lot of people are nice, or our project is big enough that we can get some amount of money from people trickling down their money. But I think that if our project can't even get enough to pay, like the yearly amount we get is less than one, I guess, salary at like say Microsoft or something, then the random projects that are trying to be sustainable, they might not even be able to get enough at all. But yeah, there's a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask
I'm
you,
also-
Chris, to speak? Oh, Floor, please go ahead.
I'm also curious how does it work if you have, the 1 month you have this much coming in and the other month you have this much coming in? How do you sort of like, how do you optimize for that? Like, how do you make sure that you have sort of a baseline somehow, and you can manage whenever, like there's more or less coming in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I was thinking, when you're trying to get a job, right, you're trying to figure out what company to work for. Something that's on your mind isn't something like how much money they have. It's usually like they have millions of dollars from VC funding, or it's like a Microsoft, Google, they have billions of dollars. But if I told someone I was going to work at Babbel, which is not even a company, and we only have like less than 100,000 or whatever a year, you probably wouldn't want to work there. So I think what we decided, and this is just our team, is that I don't want to track what people are doing, like, micromanage, like, hey, every hour you have to write down what you're doing and like all this stuff. I think just for our team, it's pretty small. We trust based on what work they've done in the past. They're not going to just like, I don't know, chill, like, just go on vacation and just do nothing. So we trust what they're doing, and we don't want the burden of like tracking their hours and what, just like do the work that you think is valuable. And, it's not like we don't know what other people are doing on the team either. So it's like, I think that makes it different than just like, oh, I want to pay someone per hour, and then based on how much we're getting per month, we're going to change that amount. We're kind of like right now we're dealing with some issues now because we lost a lot of funding, I guess, at the beginning of this year, maybe COVID, stuff like that, which is kind of ironic because all the tech companies have more to give. And so we're struggling with like, well, if we give all of us less money because we're getting less per month, then we can like sustain ourselves longer. But at some point, if the trend continues downward, like you're giving yourself like, say it was 8K and now it's 6K and now it's 1K a month just to like live off of. We're kind of buying in the idea for like internalizing ourselves the idea that we're only worth that much. And so it almost feels like at first I was like, oh, we should just spend the least amount so that it'll never be like the balance will never be zero. But now I'm like, okay, we might as well just spend all the money because, first I need a certain amount to live, and also maybe, people won't want to donate because we're not using the money for some reason. So there's like this weird thing I never thought that I would have to think about before that, but it's like normally you want your runway to last a certain amount of time, but it actually makes sense to just use it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and I saw Chris and Penelope both like nod when when you said like, oh yeah, like since the beginning of the sort of pandemic, we saw like a dip in the funds. Can either of you like talk a little bit more about that? That's concerning.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background, I guess, Ruby Central pays primarily for the hosting of rubygems.org, which is where all Ruby developers go to get open source packages. Like, you can't install Ruby packages without Ruby gems. And like, basically the funding model for Ruby Central is that we run RubyConf and RailsConf each year and use the revenues from those conferences to like keep the bank account liquid so that we can run Ruby Gems, right? Not to say that Ruby Gems doesn't have sort of like ongoing sponsors for hosting and monitoring and everything, but like fundamentally you need some liquid cash just to survive as an organization. And RailsConf is in late April, early May of every single year. Well, March of last year, you know, we were like getting ready to run this conference. We were like, what's this COVID thing? And so like we had to very quickly pivot from running a like in-person physical conference with lots of sponsors to a free virtual conference, basically. And you know, that was a probably $1 million revenue hit for us, if not more. And you know, we have now pivoted to sort of like virtual with sponsorships and paid tickets and so on. But it's taken us nearly a full year to dig ourselves out of that hole, right? And that like some of that, frankly, is it has been a lot harder to get sponsor dollars from corporations that have traditionally been more forthcoming with those sponsor dollars. And it's sort of, I don't know, it's been interesting to note, I guess, from my perspective, that like the DevRel budgets are still there, right? They still exist. And nobody's flying around anymore. And so I'm curious as to whether this is like a pulling back or people are changing strategy or sort of like what's going on. But from my perspective, and certainly this has actually become sort of less true, I think, as the pandemic has gone on. But at the beginning of the pandemic, it was very confusing.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, nothing but sympathy for running events during the pandemic. Like we had to learn all these new things around executing like force majeure clauses and legal contracts. And, you know, for us as an open source foundation, you know, supporting Kubernetes and Prometheus, we do large events, 10,000, 15,000 plus people. So the capital outlay that you have to, you know, do these events, and then you're kind of on the hook for, especially when it's about, you know, a third to half of your revenue for an organization, can be painful. We were oddly lucky where we have other revenue sources through memberships, which kind of waned. I think it follows the pattern we've seen in sponsors, where maybe companies or individuals pulled back due to the pandemic. One odd thing we saw, at least for us, is we do training courses, and it seems maybe people's events, marketing, or DevRel budgets, you know, picked up a little bit on training. And so we were kind of able to buffer our overall losses based on that. But I think it is hard for whether it's an open source organization or project, you know, depending on how you make your money, whether it's donations or events or trainings. I think just like any business, diversifying your revenue pool kind of helps things be sustainable, where, you know, I look up, you know, to Henry and like commend what he's kind of trying to do, just, you know, taking sponsorship money, but like that's kind of just one main revenue source, right? Like if that goes away, that hurts. Like maybe there's ways to diversify things. I saw GitHub sponsors add some kind of new features where maybe you could sell training through there. I don't know, but it's, you know, I think finding ways to diversify revenue outside of just purely donations or memberships, I think are key for sustainability for any open source organization or project.
Emma, you were about to comment on this?
Well, I'm thinking, so I'm thinking with my other hat on, I'm part of the open source diversity group. And we just recently, like we've been collecting sponsorship money to put together a gathering. So the Ruby gathering reminded me of that. But of course, around COVID, didn't happen. And so people be making regular donations, and we just had a conversation about, you know, what do we do with this? Like, what is the right way to, you know, we definitely need this overhaul of our website. What is the fair way, right, to like ask someone, like, these are just like very, and I realize that sort of resource would be really helpful for like some very organic communities like ours, where there's different leadership, there's people that might be willing to do that, you know, some of the work, but you talk to someone who's been the maintainer, there's sort of a lot of unknown questions. So we have this money sitting there. We're not 100% sure how to move forward with it now that our purpose for it has changed. But there's plenty of uses. So I was just thinking, wouldn't it be great to have like a resource, and maybe it exists, to help, you know, very informal communities like ours leverage, you know, our funds in a way that doesn't become controversial, because that can be a thing in the open source community. So it was a question. That's all.
Yeah, there's two things that I was curious to hear more about. Henry, you mentioned Chris's article on essentially the gig economy, right? Turning the risk of having open source turn into a gig economy. And so I would be super curious to hear maybe you, Chris, talk a bit about this perspective. And then the other thing that I'm also, that you also just pointed out right now, Chris, was essentially like once you start to have an open source project that you want to maintain full time, you're essentially running a business. Right, and I think this is something that a lot of folks, in general. I mean, I moved from being employed to being a consultant, and yeah, like that was tough. Like, it's unexpectedly brutal, and you have to spend a lot of your time just doing businessy thing like accounting or marketing or like sales, right? Like all of those words that engineers hate, right? And so I think one of the interesting aspects of that too is sort of figuring out, like recognizing the value of all of this work surrounding coding, including documentation, including all of these other aspects that we tend to forget about. So yeah, if you could speak first to the gig economy thing, I would love that. And then maybe speaking to the business thing later is also something I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you kind of mentioned, from going from full-time employment to kind of like starting your own consulting thing. I think about over 15 years ago, I did the same thing where a lot of us were at IBM working on a developer tool called Eclipse, which was, popular back then. And we just decided to, quit and try to start a company. And kind of people made fun of us for a while because it's like, hey, you're still working on the project, but now like no one's paying you to do it. We're like, yeah. And so, I mean, eventually, we got some initial consulting contracts and, tried to work our way around it. And I think that experience shaped me, regarding this whole gig economy, because I am sensitive to, at the time, we didn't take any VC funding. I tried to figure out like healthcare in the US is a nightmare. So that's kind of a unique issue to America and kind of how you figure that out when you start your own company. So, I'm seeing kind of, 15 plus years ago, open source was still very kind of nascent and like, it's just had like unbridled success. Like it's a plethora of riches and options on like different libraries you could use, different languages. We definitely have some projects that kind of fall through the cracks, but my big issue is I think the solution to sustainability relies in companies caring more about what they use and finding ways to kind of fund those things, whether it's full-time employment where people get, great pay and benefits. There's a lot of companies out there that do kind of fund this stuff, but not enough, versus trying to go the donation approach where you're just like constantly either begging for money or trying to do contracts on your own. And that doesn't even include like all the businessy things you talked about of like going through like companies' terrible invoice, procurement systems, how does retirement work, depending which country you were. So I'm just kind of, I worry that things like GitHub sponsors and others are fooling people and like, this is truly sustainable. I think Henry's done a very commendable job in proving it, but I think it's a more of a unique case compared to other individuals. I think we need to shift the conversation to get companies to either hire people so they work part-time and take it seriously. Like I look at some of these corporate sustainability reports and like there's some good things there about companies like caring about climate change or supply chain, but like oddly open source is not mentioned. I think we just need to like up level the conversation and have companies support people either through full-time hiring or funding and not force maintainers kind of, going the tip jar approach. And I tried to summarize that in my blog post about my concerns. Especially linking to like, it's not unique. There's other communities like artists on Patreon or like streamers these days on Twitch and stuff, right? It's just a hard problem, I think overall. I think the solution is trying to get companies to do more in the space or up level that conversation. But that's my view. I don't know. Feel free to read the post and tell me what you think. I don't know. I'm sure you have thoughts on this, Toby, because you reached out when I wrote that initially.
Right. No, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think I would add to that the fact that contrary to artists whose production is not tangibly valuable so clearly, like the output of open source developers is concretely being used to power the whole technology, the whole tech industry, right? So I don't want to dismiss the value of art or music at all. Like, I'm a former musician, like, just to, to give context, right? But like, clearly it's easier to, it's easier to look at this. I think like we don't have as many excuses in that field. That's what I wanted to say. And I think Emma, you also wanted to add something to
Yeah,
this?
I love how you raised
Yeah.
your hand. We're definitely missing the raise your hand.
Yeah, no, every tool is different. Every tool is different. It's like, where's that feature? Oh, this one doesn't have that. Yeah, so I just listening to Chris, I think I maybe just wanted to talk a little bit more about like Microsoft's basically the intentions, like a lot of what Chris is talking about, like hiring maintainers and thinking about like the GitHub sponsors of the FOSS fund. Like, this is one way that Microsoft gives back, and it has those kind of we're trying to, like, it's an educational opportunity for people to think about use. It's a way that we can connect with projects we're using, but we also recently for the FOSS fund, I went looking. We have like a query database where I can look at use, right? Like, how many, let's get some of these nominees that people aren't bringing up that we use all the time. And I started to go through them. It's like, oh, we've hired that maintainer. Oh, like we've hired, like I started to recognize, and this is kind of sometimes hard to talk about, but I think Microsoft is an example of where that is happening. And I'd be interested in, how we can make that more visible or repeatable. But so that's happening, and I'm proud of that. I think internally also that we're part of a lot of foundations, like we're founding member of the Rust Foundation and the OpenSSF. Like, there's a lot of money, funds, whatever the word is, that go into that as well. So I'm pretty proud of that. And then internally, the culture at Microsoft, there's a lot of, when I first came in, I've been only here for 6 months, but one of the questions I asked is like, what should Microsoft be doing more of? And there's a push internally. There's a lot of, great people inside of Microsoft saying, I have ideas for how we can fund, and like, here's how we can level this up. And here, like inside of the organization, creating that culture where people can push those ideas, I think is something else we're doing really well. And, I think we'll ultimately have that kind of impact externally on projects we use or contribute to. So, I just wanted to say those things. And I think that it's not one, but it's all of these and probably more. Like, there's probably another thing, but building that culture internally where people can propose that and feel empowered that their voice will be listened to is a big part of where we're headed as well.
I'd also be curious, when hiring maintainers, how much freedom do they have to choose what they're able to work on? Like, I can imagine that, and I know from your README profile, Henry, that's a concern as well. Is can you work on like the nitty gritty stuff, like the stuff that is maintenance, that is not glamorous at all, or do you feel like you need to work on stuff that brings value to the company, that is paying you to work on the project, or that is maybe more PR worthy? That would also be a question. Nobody needs to take it. I just want to put it out there.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly, when I was at Facebook, so in 2010, so before Facebook really did a huge push in open source, people internally would joke about Facebook is where open source projects come to die, right? So it was full of open source developers because hiring from open source was a thing that still happens, right? But then people would start being focused on internal projects, and the project would just die. So then that sort of like created a push inside, and ended up was creating things like React, and so there was a real cultural change around this. But like at the beginning, it really was what was happening, and I think we still see a lot of that in the industry. I'd like to maybe give Jory the speaking, baton for how to, because we talked about, funding open source projects sort of as building your own business the way Henry is doing with Babel. We talked about corporate funding of open source through hiring people, and Jory has like this unique experience of having participated to something that's sort of like in the middle of that, and was Open Web Docs, and I find that that's a really exciting thing, and I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so this is, I think, pretty novel. I'm not aware of another project that's done this just yet, but like many projects, we're on Open Collective as a tool for being able to collect a diverse, different types of funds from both corporate contributors to also individual donors who are supporting us with their monthly, subscription. But because we're leveraging the Open Collective Foundation as a fiscal host, they have a arrangement which we've built with a PEO agency, and you may be familiar with these, Chris and Toby, but for others, a PEO agency is functionally a type of company that's like staffing. They're typically used by larger companies when they're thinking about, for example, going into business in a new country, but aren't ready to incorporate in those countries. And so what we realized was that our team that we're looking to support, which were folks who had been part of the Indian layoffs, they are global. We wanted to be able to provide them the same salary, the same benefits and that kind of thing, but just having maybe had to separate that from the corporate parent, Mozilla, and also wanting to be able to fund this work as a neutral collection of organizations. We're working with this PEO agency now to provide legally compliant full-time employment, where they are getting their benefits, they're getting their retirement accounts and that sort of thing in their local currency in their country, but it is actually employment. I think it's pretty brand spanking new. Cannot recommend it as a thing that people need to go run out and try right away. But we're experimenting with this, and so far it's working really well for our team. And we've got 2 employees of the program right now, and we will have 2 more hopefully by the end of June. And I'll hopefully have more interesting data to share about this experiment at that point in time. But I'm very grateful to Microsoft, Google, Coil, and a few Igalia and a few others who I cannot name yet for their support of this experiment.
Yeah, so talking about data, Chris, you shared some really interesting data points over email with us, and would you like to sort of like give us the context of the survey you ran, and what kind of like insights you got out of it?
1 second, I'm trying to find the link for you, but
it's very fresh data.
Yeah, no, it's very fresh data. Oh, you got it. Cool. So, one thing we're kind of doing is, I think there's kind of 2 things. I think there's a lot of kind of, let's call them feels around like open source sustainability. And one thing that we've been trying to do is, get more of a research bent. Let's get, professionals doing research. We've partnered with Harvard and a couple other institutions, kind of just figure out like, let's go survey maintainers directly. Let's go analyze actually package registries and other stuff to get kind of like hard data on whether, what's happening or there's like abandoned dependencies. So we did this recently that we published with Harvard, and, some of the insights that Elisa mentioned, over email, obviously there's going to be some, bias to the results since, that we're surveying our community and whoever Harvard could get access to. But we do find that like the majority of people like that are contributing to open source projects, I think about 75% have some level of full-time employment, right? I think we underestimate how many people generally have gainful employment working on open source. I think the issue is that there are just a lot of projects out there, and there's also optionality. Sometimes I've had discussions with maintainers that will remain nameless where they're just like, no one's funding my project. And, I'm like, that you have like 10 other options to do what you're doing, right? Maybe that's kind of the message to you, that that's like, it's like you don't have enough of a unique value proposition or business for someone to kind of fund you, I think is one angle. The other interesting thing that kind of came up in the report is I think it was about 20% or so, their employers just had no clear policies on FOSS contribution and so on, which, if there's no clear policy, then obviously you're missing out, potentially a fifth of companies out there maybe contributing to upstream. That seems like an easy fix for us potentially to work on as a community together. The other thing that came up was the percentage of time dedicated to like security fixes and so on, which is kind of becoming a major issue with kind of all these like hacks we read about and all these kind of crazy intrusions, is I think it was like 3% of like dedicated time was reserved to deal with security issues kind of across the board, which I don't know what the right number is for that, but that probably seems a little bit low. I'd be kind of curious to hear from Henry kind of how he manages kind of that process and maybe which time. But, I think there's just kind of clear opportunities where, we should do more to kind of ensure that companies around the world have clear FOSS policies to make it easier for, employees and folks to contribute back. And then, potentially look at, can we increase the amount of time that people have to contribute to FOSS? So I think on top of what I mentioned, I think it was something like, let me go look at the data real quick. It was like 48% of respondents are paid by their employer to contribute to FOSS at some time, and that's just like a chunk of time. That's not necessarily full time or part time. So it's just some discrete bit of time. I think what we could do is to help increase that number, especially for like important projects for companies, and maybe identifying them a little more to, a company can kind of go and see like, oh, I maybe depend on all this stuff, or this is truly something that, is important for a product. We should try to contribute, whether it's, to Ruby Together or to, I don't know, Let's Encrypt or whatever, some type of project if they accept money that way. But we're going to continue to kind of fund more of this research, and I would love, more, academics and professional organizations kind of do more concrete research around this problem, so we actually have hard data. So.
Yeah, and better definitions, because sometimes sounds a little bit fuzzy to me. Is that on a Friday afternoon when like all other work is done, that they get a minute? That doesn't sound really good or structural or something that is sustainable. Yeah, you mentioned Ruby Together, so might as well talk about Ruby Together, Penelope.
Yeah, I mean, as Jory was talking a little bit about the work she did there, it reminded me a little bit of Ruby Together, which is a foundation I don't represent, but is a member of the Ruby community. And so just with that prefix, so like what Ruby Together does is it basically like takes membership subscriptions from Ruby companies and then sort of acts as a company that then pays maintainers in the Ruby ecosystem to work on important Ruby projects. So Bundler, Ruby Gems have both received a significant amount of funding from Ruby Together. And I think like what's sort of interesting about this, the organization, is that like it was sort of started like very grassroots, right? The maintainer of Bundler was like, it would be great if I could get paid to do this. Like, let me set up my own 501c6, like get a board of directors, and then the sort of like, and it's sort of grown into like funding a number of maintainers doing different things. They pay like decent rates by comparison with sort of like market consulting rates for software engineers. And I like, to me, it's a really compelling funding story, because the value prop is, hey, companies that depend materially on these projects, we put money directly into those projects, right? Yeah.
Do you know anything about how, like, where does Ruby Together sit in that? Like, are they in contact with the companies that fund and so report on, I don't know, progress or what's being worked on? I'd be curious too.
Yeah, so obviously not as an insider, but knowing those who are, like, it's effectively like a sales job for them, right? Like, they are going to these companies, they are like establishing initial contact, like having conversations about the benefits, working out which plan these companies want to buy, right? So like Ruby
Most
Together
popular
Staff,
one, right? That's the one in the middle, right?
right?
Yeah.
The one in the middle with the so Ruby Together Staff are in some sense literally doing sales to these companies, right? And then they sort of collect the revenue, and then most of it goes to maintainers. You know, there are some salaries for Ruby Together staff and some administrative fees and that sort of thing. But like a 501c6, right, is a technical term. It's a trade organization, which is not quite the same thing as a not-for-profit. For the Americans listening, if you're familiar with Got Milk adverts, no milk farm in the United States can afford a like national TV spot, but the Trade Association for Milk Farmers can, right? And so it's that kind of organization that like independent companies join.
Yeah, and to that also, maybe Emma, Chris also raised his hand. For the Fuzz Fund, as we had 9 editions now, do you have any experiences to share or success stories from projects that received funding and what they've done with that, and how do you communicate that back to the people that have voted?
Well, we're saying we're approaching 10. I don't think that we really, at least I have no intention of asking how those funds were used. That feels like a lot to ask, and so we are inviting a lot of the projects to be nominated or won to our internal meetups to describe how our engineers and others can contribute to the projects ongoing. So to keep, I think my goal would be to continue to build that relationship. It might be through like more funding, but also by making sure that our engineers and others are connected to the opportunity to contribute, like, upstream security patches, whatever. So I think that's where we're going next. Maybe at some point we'll talk about, maybe more collectively across multiple the companies that are all running FOSS funds as a kind of a united, not a united, but like a shared approach that others can learn from versus, hey, look what we did or look what happened, right? It's I think it's more like the ethos of the effort rather than the output. So.
Yeah, and I love it because it sounds very romantic, but I'm sort of afraid that companies will like if they don't have any metrics on what the money is used for, they might give it up as something that is costing too much money in the long term. That's why I think I'm asking. Chris, you're nodding.
Yeah.
Like, I love it when someone thinks I'm right. So please.
Yeah, no, it's Henry's comment on like donations potentially leading to a sense of obligation is, I think, definitely true. So Penelope mentioned Ruby Together. So like CNCF is very similarly structured as a 501c6. We collect dues from members. We also make revenue via potentially events and training, and it essentially goes to fund common efforts that our members agree to like essentially not compete on. So we don't have full-time engineers that say work on Kubernetes or Prometheus because essentially members prefer to hire those engineers directly. And it's kind of a competitive thing where they're okay with us hiring like people to work on technical documentations because no one likes to work on docs, right? They rather have engineers work on features or something that helps move a product forward. But docs, all goodness. Translations, developer advocacy, those type of common things. And we essentially pull, at the end of the year, we just generate a report of like, here's where all the common, dollars went, just like any other kind of nonprofit trying to justify people giving it money over time.
Yeah, so we're seeing a pattern here, right? I mean, Joe was just mentioning in the private chat, like, this is why I'm running Open Web Docs, right? Because again, like it's a doc, and MDN is like a critical resource for any web developer. Like everyone goes there, like everyone types like MDN array.prototype right? to get that data on Google, right? So I mean, this is really critical, and do you want to say more about like this relationship to? I mean, talk more to this relationship that we have to like docs or all of these critical things that we consider just there and don't want to pay for.
Well, I've just been thinking about how the different methods that exist today for financially contributing to an open source project intersect with the inherent like nature of that and purpose of that project. You know, when you look at something like MDN, which I view as pretty critical infrastructure for the web platform today. Maybe others might not agree with that, but I think it's pretty integral. It's as integral as the languages themselves at this point. And so to me, to address the needs of maintaining that infrastructure, we really need a lot. We need a lot of support. We need something that is heavier weight, like a foundation, like a system that does employ people to work on this exclusively, you know, agnostic of any specific corporation's product interests and that sort of thing. And so that's what we are trying to establish with MDN. That's a little different, though, than say another type of infrastructure like Penelope mentioned, Bundler, also super critical, but perhaps not as not as much in terms of maintenance and scale as documenting the living web platform. And so it may be able to sustain in a different set of like funding processes. And then there's like I maintain this currently popular, you know, front-end web framework called Prototype.js. Chip me a few extra dollars, please, so that I can send someone, you know, some swag, or go to that conference and speak on behalf of the project. Like those, like things. There's a scale, and it's sort of where my brain is right now. Sorry for rambling.
I think that's really interesting that like we do have this very diverse like the idea of talking about funding open source is like too much of a reduction, right? Like, because there are so many different like kinds of things in open source. Like at the very top, I mentioned RubyGems.org. You know, RubyGems is a web service with a hosting budget in the, you know, the high five figures, right? That is yet another completely different thing. Or like running the Docker registry, right? I mean, like if the Docker registry goes down, like, you know, and so like I think a lot of people just are like, there's all this free stuff, we can consume it, it's great. But it's very unclear like how paid for and maintained, and there's like a sliding scale, right? You know, the other day in Ruby, we had a big issue where someone changed the license on a core underpinning package and blew up basically the entire ecosystem. Like Rails was deeply impacted by this. And it's like, well, that person is like some poor unpaid maintainer that's been doing this for a decade. And all of a sudden they're like, yeah, I'm yanking all of the packages, like, good luck, have fun. And like, you know, like, I think there's this really interesting idea that even big things can sometimes depend on like these tiny little pieces, right? And so it's not just about funding those headline projects, it's also about everything down the chain, right? An open source supply chain is like a very interesting topic of discussion right now.
Something I've noticed happening with some of the projects in OpenJS are that they are opening collectives not to receive funds for themselves, but to fund, as a result of the collections that they're taking in, the dependencies that they have. And I think that's a very interesting subversion of like the original intention of that platform too.
Yeah, that reminds me of this famous XKCD graphic, you know, where you have...
I'll post it in the Discord.
Yeah.
We had the same
thought.
thought.
Someone just mentioned it here. Yes, okay. Oh, yeah, you just did. Yeah. Essentially, we just realize that you have all of this infrastructure, and it holds on this critical piece of infrastructure that no one really knows about or heard about, and that suddenly something happens to it. I mean, we've seen this with Heartbleed and OpenSSL like a number of years ago, which I think sort of like started, really shook the industry to really consider this and think about this seriously, and so really started focusing people on sustainability. So I guess it had an upside of sorts. Floor, are you still under a hailstorm, or is it getting better?
It's on and off. Like,
Okay.
I don't know what it is with tonight. Like, first I don't get my machine started, and then I'm in a hailstorm, and it's so loud, can't hardly hear you. But now it's good again.
I was
well.
wondering if we had eventual questions that were coming in, or not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
But it's a good reminder for the peeps, watching, to put in your questions in Discord, and we'll make sure to relay them to our wonderful panel.
So
maybe
please.
maybe Emma, you can talk a little bit about you. I mean, you're an ex-Mozillian. How do you call yourself? Sorry,
Mozillian.
Thank you. So maybe you can talk about that experience as well a little bit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I was at Mozilla for almost 7 years, and actually I came to Mozilla as a contributor. I pivoted my career from an engineer to kind of teaching. I felt like empowering people to understand technology was kind of my way of paying for the opportunity I've been given, and especially around open source. I really focused on teaching people how to get involved in open source from a career perspective, right? Like, this is a way to break through the glass ceiling, right? Like, learn skills that you wouldn't otherwise have, meet people, of course, within the context of healthy communities where codes of conduct were maintained. And yeah, I worked a lot on community and open innovation, open strategy there. I worked with the MDN team a little bit sort of peripherally, so I have great admiration for the work I think Jory's doing, and is so important and critical. I'm so pleased to see that happening, because I know that when some of those developers went away, there's a lot of outrage, like, how can we help? This is so important. It was almost like an awakening, right? Like, oh, this is just here. Like, this is just here. Yeah, and there was layoffs last year, and we're sort of pivoting over at Mozilla. But I think a lot of us that have been at Mozilla, or contributors or staff or otherwise, stay connected with that mission of empowerment and an open web. So, yeah.
Yeah, and when there's such outrage, like, where do people actually get, or a company can actually get some information on how to set up a FOSS fund, or how to figure out ways of supporting these projects? If there's an answer, like, maybe there's no answer.
So, I mean, the FOSS fund is an internal-facing program right now within companies. But if people wanted to, for example, fund. So you're asking if somebody just wants to fund a project. I mean, there's GitHub sponsors, there's Open Collective, which we use at the diversity team. I think it really depends on the project you're looking to contribute to, because even Mozilla is a community of communities. So there's, the add-ons community has a different way of contributing. But as far as funds go, I think it really differs on the project. But it's a great question to ask, especially as we start to realize those dependencies, right? Docs being one of them. Like, we need those to be up to date. We need, an evolution of that contributing to continue.
I'll just share a little bit about what it took to get the web doc solution, pulled together. In the case of the changes at MDN, one of the things that we had to take advantage of was a great group of companies and people called the Product Advisory Board, who were pulled together by Mozilla to specifically help support and weigh in on product direction and that sort of thing at Mozilla. And when these layoffs occurred last year, the Product Advisory Board was uniquely positioned to be able to try and step in and find a solution. And one of the things that we all considered was, what if we hired the people who were let go and just brought them into our respective organizations and said, okay, your job is to work on MDN, but you're going to do it now as a such and such employee. And pretty quickly we realized that was actually just sort of pushing a potential problem further down, because it's pretty easy once you get that resource into an organization to say that person may be dedicated to work on that thing for, a few months, but then reorg happens, product direction changes, something, and that isn't necessarily sustainable either. So the idea to kind of pool it and work it as a team as opposed to bringing it in-house was really, really like we liked that a lot. I can't think of the word that I was looking to use. So that's and thankfully we were able to move very quickly thanks to the folks at the Open Collective and the organization that does provide the employment, the PEO agency. And so we were able to get it up and going in about 2 months, which I think is a lot faster than it would have been able to occur had we gone down a more traditional route of establishing our own C6 entity, which is still on the table. We can certainly grow into that if that's what we want to do. But this was a get it done quickly.
Awesome. Chris, you wanted to share a link to OSS Fund also?
Yeah, I don't know who could see the chat, but OSS.fund, I actually don't know who runs it, but they've kind of done a interesting categorization of different monetization platforms, whether it's like donations, crowdfunding, advertising, bounties, etc. So I think it's probably the most comprehensive resource of different monetization options, I think, for open source creators out there. I don't know of a better one, at least. But just go to oss.fund in the browser.
And so I wanted to also mention the FOSS Fund was actually, as far as I know, something that was started by Dwayne O'Brien at Indeed. And he actually worked with his team and open source all of the sort of like internal infrastructure and the sort of like policies to actually run as a corporation to run your own FOSS fund. And so you can find all of that on GitHub at Indeed Eng, and it's FOSS-contributor-fund. And so there's all sort of like the way that they're running this, sort of the good practices that they've been using for that. So I think that's also a really useful resource if, as an organization, you want to run that. And I'd like to actually go back to Henry and sort of, again, having him be on the receiving end of all of that, sort of maybe if you could talk, Henry, to what would be the most effective ways that organizations could sponsor you, like the least disruptive or the most supporting? I think would be that would be interesting to hear more about and valuable.
Like the ideal situation, the pipe dream. I mean, I guess it would be to just get paid at a company and then not have to worry about all the other business stuff, right? Like the insurance and all that. But then, like we mentioned earlier, like I tried doing that at Adobe, and then also, I guess, seeing if anyone wanted to hire me for that. But I think I applied to some companies, but I realized that like people have mentioned about the reorg and stuff. I've never had to go through that. I guess I already left, but it seems like you could like get hired to work on X project, and then 6 months later, it's going to change. I don't know anything about like writing in your contract that you have to do this. Like that doesn't seem like something you could do. So I guess at the time I was like, I'm going to do my own experiment. I'm going to just do this on my own, quote unquote, and see where that goes. I guess pursuing some kind of freedom where I guess it's like, I want to be able to not wake up and not feel bad that I'm doing like the wrong thing because someone gave me money and now I feel obligated to do what they want, which is what I feel a lot of the times, which sucks. But I think that I
was just gonna say, is there a way, like, because I'd really love to learn how to not, like, what makes you feel that way? Is there specific like types of donations or wording or just that they happen? Because that feels like a good challenge to tackle, because that's not ideal.
Right. I think maybe this is related to the whole gig economy and the stuff that Chris was talking about with the GitHub sponsors, right? When we do like tiers, it would be like, if you give me $50, I'll look at your issue, like stuff like that. That becomes very like transactional, and like not even companies, but mostly individuals, they might expect more out of what you gave because you gave them money, quote unquote. And so I guess it's like, how do we change the expectation on what's required and that trust that you have for the person working on it, that if you've already trusted them to work on this project for free because you didn't pay them, then why do you think that just because you gave them money that now they're going to suddenly run away? I mean, they might, but like most likely they're not going to just stop because you gave them money. If anything, hopefully, like you want to give them money and then trust them enough to do what they feel like is the right thing, instead of like, I always have this like in the back of my mind, like, oh, people want me to write code or people want me to do X, Y, Z. And that's why and that makes me even more anxious because I'm like, well, I want to do this other thing, but then people want me to do this. I've had a lot of people that have been questioning kind of like what I do, but that's not most people. It's just like, it's there. And then it's like kind of the YouTube comments where like random people say things and then you just don't know like how to feel about it. I don't know, just, yeah.
I really want to just follow on a little bit from what Henry was saying there, because like so much of this is resonating with me. So previous to my work at Ruby Central, I was the lead maintainer of RSpec, which is a very popular testing framework in the Ruby ecosystem. And at one point, we actually received like, I can't remember how much it was, but it was like a bunch of money that like some company just gave to us for like being important. And we as like the group of maintainers were just wholly unready to like receive that. We were like, what are we going to do with this? Like we didn't have a mechanism to like get it to any of the people. Like there were various people with visa conditions, which means they can and can't accept payments from different kinds of legal entities. Like it was actually like just receiving the money was probably more work to get it to people than the money itself was worth. And that like, I think there are, and this is less true today, but this was certainly true up until maybe, 5 years ago, that there were ridiculously popular open source projects that had no funding at all. Like, were like not even ready to receive fund. Like if you showed up to them with like, we'll pay, we'll give you $1 million because there's 5 maintainers here and that's like a year's worth of salary for you. Like they wouldn't have known what to do with it, right? And that, like, I think sort of like having the open source funds is great until like, a target comes along, which turns out like the Mime Magic Jam where the maintainer, for example, isn't ready, right? Or like, I'm sort of just like, I would be very curious to hear from the panel if anyone's ever had any experiences where like somebody wants to give money to an open source project and that person is just like, we don't know how to do that. Like, does that happen in your experience?
I love Henry's face that is just like, that sounds like a luxury problem to me.
I definitely experienced that trying to give money in the short time. Like some projects don't have the fiscal organizational setup. So I included in the chat a little bit earlier, I'm not sure everyone sees that, a link to a project that actually directs funds directly to developers, GitHub sponsors. So kind of bypassing the idea of like there being a main like bank account or something for a project, and they direct it to the developers, which was like so much easier for everyone involved. At least, I hear what Penelope was saying about, depends where in the world you live and all those things. So like it's not everything, but definitely like it does present challenges.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because like all of the solutions we've kind of talked about here, like Jory has like the payroll company and like a foundation above it, right? Like we have a 501c6. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation does like a similar thing. Or like there are a few places where like there's places maintainers can go, but like it doesn't seem like there's and I mean GitHub sponsors kind of helps with this. I don't know. But it seems like there's no like universal solution to this yet, and that like especially because the supply chain is so diverse, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that like I'm sort of, because like in my head what these corporate open source programs are really for, right, is shoring up like all of the stuff you depend on that like you've traditionally been getting for free. It's just very curious to me to like how deep that goes before you're just like, we can't get the funding to you.
I've certainly worked with maintainers who have chosen not to accept, funds because they do view it as, you say, like much more of a headache than the funds are nominally worth. Or they say, yes, I'm the face of this project, but I actually have a couple of people who are helping me. and it doesn't seem fair. I don't have a system for making decisions about how to allocate this. I don't have a system for recognizing it. There's also these the points that you raise around visa concerns, or in the US, if you are on disability, you can't earn above a certain amount. There's a ton of interesting problems that arise when you look at the intersection of just getting a gift of money with tax law, and how and then which organizations along the way in that chain, be it GitHub sponsors, Stripe, Open Collective, or whatever, who are going to take a percentage off of that. And I think one of the things that concerns me most, speaking to Chris's earlier article on the Uberization of open source, is the fact that some of the platforms that are facilitating this are the ones that are actually making the money here, not really the maintainers. And so that's my
right. And there's like another thing that's kind of mixed into this, which Henry was talking about, which is kind of this like sense of obligation or sense of entitlement. I have definitely witnessed as a maintainer somebody showing up to my repo and be like, "Hey, fix this thing." Ping, 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 like just consistently like bumping it to the top, and I'm like, "Hey, I work on this during nights and weekends, right? This is not my full-time job. Like, this happens when I feel like it." And that, like, if somebody is then paying or sponsoring, I'm sure that like that entitlement would only amplify. And like, I sort of think there's like almost a pre-existing notion of open source entitlement amongst some developers before we even talk about funding. And that like, I think like the closer that person is to making a payment to the specific repo, like I'm sort of here talking a little bit about payment mechanisms, right? If you're diffusely giving money to the Ruby community or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, that's very different to like rolling up to, the RSpec jam and being like, "Here's $500, fix my issue," right?
Yeah.
I want to quickly, because we have a audience question, and Henry, I looked at your GitHub sponsors page, and I love that we can support you with bubble tea, bubble tea or a meal, or and I love how you're sort of like tongue in cheek talking about what support will buy you, literally. But the question from the audience is: should project be transparent in how they use the funding?
I guess quick note on what I do for the tiers is I mentioned I didn't want the Patreon type thing to be transactional. So what I would say is I don't really give them anything. I'm just saying I'm offering the opportunity to basically hang out, even though now we can't do that. And it's like, and I would also say I would do it anyway. It's like you don't have to give money to be able to get bubble tea with me or whatever. It's just kind of like here's just a suggestion, because I didn't want them to feel like they needed to give to me, and I don't want to feel like I need to like do something that they told me or whatever. Even though I think it's one of those things where like you believe a lot of stuff in your head, but then like in reality I don't actually feel that way, and I think that's true of like me feeling like I need to write code. Like I know that's not the only thing that's important, but yet I still feel like an obligation. But I guess the other question, I guess. The transparency thing I think is interesting. There's some level of accountability. I guess the being in public in general, you have to have some kind of scrutiny. But then it's like I don't want my whole life to be public. I think this trend of, like we were talking about live streaming. We have this guy Ludwig. He's streaming his whole life the last 20 days. He's like making a lot of money, but at what cost? And also these things that I'm doing, say I talk to some company for like sales to try to get them to donate. I don't want to have to make a README and put a little line on my GitHub just to show up, just to tell someone I did something because I talked to someone. So it's like not everything needs to be measured, but I guess there's some balance on like, oh, how do we know you're not doing it? Like you're not doing anything. I don't know. And let's say with Patreon, you give money to that person. You have no idea how they're spending it, right? You have no idea what they're using it for. And it's for an individual. But then for Open Collective, everything's public. You see how much I guess I make or I take, what all we're spending and stuff like that. And then And it's almost weird because it like turns into some kind of liability in a way where it's like most of the time no one cares. People, they're too busy with their own lives, right? Why do you care about how much other people are making when it's not even that much? And then suddenly when they want to look into it, they're like, oh, why are you doing this? Stuff like that. And it's like you have no context into what we're doing, at least within the team. It's like, why do I have to tell you or something?
Yeah, I'd like to quickly speak to this question of transparency because there's like a really big tension here, right? And which I think Henry outlines really well, which is on one hand, you do want to be transparent about a lot of things, but on the other hand, like that can't be at the expense of people's privacy and their safety. And so like getting that balance right is really difficult. And I would tend to agree with Henry that Open Collective is balancing a bit too much on the too transparent side. And I think the reason for that is Open Collective is originally a structure that was designed essentially for organizations to work together and spend money on projects and have really clear accounting for that. And here, like with open source, like this is not like it's a bit we're in something a bit different. And so I think like some form of transparency is great, but like when it essentially puts your life on display, I think that's really problematic. So this is clearly, there's a balance to be found, and I don't think we're at the right point in that balance yet.
Yeah.
Penelope, you were about to, Henry, sorry.
I was just going to say that the only reason why I'm outspoken about this is because it's like literally what I'm going through. And I guess relatively recently, just like I don't know the answers. I'm trying to figure it out too. I don't know what I'm doing, but yeah.
I wonder if there's any research. So I'm thinking about like funding platforms like GoFundMe, where people like have a cause and people fund. I know that and have like experience that people sometimes have expectations around money, even when they're giving it to people in crisis, right? Like, what did you do with that? Oh, did you go to Disneyland with that or whatever, right? Even though that's what maybe those people. So I'm just openly wondering again, like, is there like some research there that talks about those behavioral types of things that we can maybe get better at designing to combat through something like a code of conduct? But I bet there's research somewhere. So it's not just, I think it's probably like a money thing sometimes and not just an open source thing.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, and I think Henry and I were talking about this really recently. Like this is a very common behavior that we see in people. For example, when it's fairly common for people to make disparaging comments when people are using money that they've been granted by the state, for example, to fund activities that just make them feel better. Right, which when you think about it, is like extremely toxic behavior that we tend to collectively have about that. And so I think there's really something about like, I think your point is spot on about like spending money and like expectations around it. We have like there's probably a lot of research if you broaden that a bit. Sorry, Henry, you wanted to add to this?
Oh no, yeah, that's basically what you said. Yeah.
Before we sort of like dig quickly, if we have the time, into actual companies built on top of open source projects, which is like a whole other way that open source is funded. I just quickly wanted to sort of like summarize some of the conversations I had with Henry in the past around basically, like I'm seeing three things that need to get funded in an open source project that need to get sponsored, right? One is like new features. One is sort of like regular maintenance, and then the last one is just like the business, essentially like looking for funds, sales, marketing the project, project management, thinking long term about the project. And so my feeling is, in general, we tend to easily find money for features, and take all the rest for granted. And I haven't even spoken about documentation and translation and all of that, right? So I think to sort of answer, Emma, the question that you asked to Henry at some point, that maybe thinking about this when we try to fund open source projects would be really useful, and maybe trying to fund maintenance and also just the businessy stuff around the project. It's a harder sell, but like this is what creates sustainability long term for these projects.
Yeah, long term. Because I feel like it creates an incentive for projects to make features just because someone told them to. and that might not even be helpful for the project as a whole, only for that company. And then also like, yeah, just like priority on like what, but yeah, other thing like the educational parts of a project, you know, like not even docs, just like how does, like say for Babel, it's like I think a lot of people don't maybe want to fund it because it's like, well, all we're doing is making JavaScript better, and no one owns JavaScript. No company is going to say that they do that. And so if I wanted to make some tools that help people make new ideas in language extension or something, that doesn't seem like something anyone would want to fund because it's too like broad or too general.
This idea is actually really interesting to me because like JavaScript itself is like incredibly well funded in the sense of like people and committee members and so on, right? Like
Right.
the folks who go to TC39 and help evolve the direction of the language, like it's Google, Microsoft, and like Apple employees, et cetera, right? And that like, you know, there are a number of JavaScript developer advocates at those corresponding companies that are paid incredibly well to help evolve the JavaScript language, right? And so I'd sort of be curious to hear from you, like, how you perceive the difference between like the evolution of the JavaScript language being funded and the Babel compiler.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a struggle with this for like the whole time I've been working on this because I remember there was a point I was like, oh, I can actually go to the meeting. And then I was working at Adobe, but then they stopped donating because they probably had some weird fallout with like Flash or something. And so I went there, and then people are like, "Oh, you represent Adobe." I was like, "No, they didn't pay for me to go." So I'm like literally just going there because I want to. And it's not like the most exciting place to be, you know? Like 8 hours of meetings and stuff like that. And then when I quit, then it's like, well, no one's gonna find me for that. So it's like, am I just gonna go because? And then I just stopped going. But I don't know. It's like there is no TC39, I guess, like funds, I guess, for general. It's just like the companies themselves pay to go. And I guess there's some other issues around like, and Jory could speak almost about all this stuff. Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think what Henry's really pointing to is that, like, you know, when you look at the work of creating the language, for which there is a SDO ECMA that accepts membership dues, mostly for the privilege of being able to go, you know, kind of do work on that specification, and they take those funds and they use it for supporting the operations of that SDO. And also some light kind of operational meeting stuff for the committee, and that's about it. And so one would maybe assume that some of those funds would perhaps also extend to Babel or other open source implementations of some of these new features, when they in fact do not. And the question, I think, is a valid one. Shouldn't they? I actually kind of think yes, they should. Those dues gathered should also extend to support some of the open source pieces around the language. And I think people would be surprised to hear that it's actually that's not what the money goes to.
I mean, it's a lot of money per year to be on the committee, and also just being able to, like, it's one thing to say you can show up, but then, you know, you have to pay like when it was in person, you have to fly there, the hotel and everything. You know, it doesn't even have to be an open source project. You know, it could be like a school or like just a random person in their company. They can't go either. And I think that TC39 has done a good job of trying to, like, I guess, include more like different types of people, because, you know, it used to be only language people, and now there's like implementers and educators, or at least it's better than before. But I guess there's still a lot that can be changed.
I think the W3C does a slightly better job in this sense, in that they have, you know, some folks who try and organize things like funds to support invited experts or diversity attendance and scholarships and that sort of thing to some of their meetings. But you know, it sure would be great to see more of a coordinated approach between the open source community and the standards developing communities that are relying on these open source projects to, provide proof.
Right.
That'd be great.
Yeah, it's weird because it's like people create these proposals and then you just expect our project to implement them for just because someone decided to. Like, I remember many times we would do Google Summer of Code, and the only reason why something got implemented because some person that we picked to be an intern did it. And, they didn't really they kind of like sort of got paid through Google, but in a different way. It's like, and also that's just the initial implementation, because we work on things that no one wants to do. It's like, who wants to work on some piece of code that might get changed? Well, inherently will get changed because it's not, stable yet. And so like nobody is willing to pay for that because it seems like a waste of time. And then throughout the process of when it changes in the tests and the maintenance, and that supposedly that's the maintenance of Babel, regardless of all the bugs and all that. It's just like new language features itself. And no one's funding that.
Yeah, I wish we could end on a happier note, frankly.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think we're reaching the bottom of the hour, and I would have loved to talk more about open source business models, but like this feels like a whole other can of worms that if we open now, we'll be here for another 90 minutes, and I'm not sure people who are listening to us will bear with that.
Well, I mean, note to us, right? As organizers, maybe we should do a follow-up panel on that topic alone.
I'd love to hear it too. Yeah, I'd love that. I think that would be great.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, this was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining and sharing your experiences. Do we want to do a last round of, I don't know, some uplifting message or parting words? It doesn't need to be uplifting. I don't want to put that burden on you.
Let's do that, and I'll start saying something uplifting, which is I feel like 3 or 4 years ago we had the same issue, and it was a lot worse, and no one was really looking at it or caring about it, and like. Things have changed a lot in 4 years. I don't think we have all of the answers quite yet at all, but I think we're making progress, and so I think we should celebrate that.
Do we want to make the round and MS next? I'm so putting you on the spot there, and I'm so sorry. You're on mute.
Sorry, I have to unmute. Oh, no, that's fine. I just kind of echo what Toby just said. Like, I feel like, 10 years ago, even when we were contributing to open source on behalf of a company, it was more like a marketing thing. I think people are really understanding this is sustainability, that there's a responsibility and stewardship, and that makes me excited as well. Also, it's my puppy's first birthday today. So just
congrats.
Thank you.
Henry?
Well, I guess I'm just glad that we're talking about it. I mean, I don't want to end on a sad note either, but I feel like, it's like I don't want to do the thing where like, you work on it so long and then when it's finally succeeded, then you're the one that got burnt out. But that might be true.
Chris, why don't you?
I think to echo Emma's point from like, if you look back 10, 20 years ago, I think we're just in a much better state than we were previously. I think people are talking about it. There's more companies forming open source programs, funding I just feel like I'm a hopeless optimist. I do think things are getting better. I don't think there'll be one size fits all solution. There'll be many ways to do it, but at least people are talking about it. And I do think things are much better than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Jory?
I'm also really grateful for all the options that exist and also for the ones that exist today. And I'm grateful for people like Faraz and others in Henry, you too, in the community who have been doing these like random experiments, which teach us something, and they take the risk and we get to benefit from understanding what worked and what didn't. So shout out to Faraz and to many others, many other unnamed people. Thank you for all you do.
I second that. I think we're all overdoing the uplifting thing at this point. Penelope, please.
Yeah. So I'll see if I can really hammer it home then. I spent the first decade of my career as a maintainer, like writing code, shipping open source product. I have moved to a place where I'm a director of an open source foundation, and like it seems obvious to me that over the next decade, the role will be to like help maintainers get funding. I think that will be the big change, and that like that hasn't been the case traditionally. And so I think the reason we're having a discussion like this now is that the opportunity has never been greater, and it's time to seize it.
Wow, that was
That was great. Dang.
So I'll do the close out. So next week we're back with another, Contributing Today meetup. We'll be talking about open gaming and open source game dev. So that's something else entirely for once. And the week after we'll be talking about SRE. So next week, same time, depending on whether or not we'll have another summertime, wintertime, I don't know. Judging by the climate, maybe, and hope to see you all then. And thank you all for joining for the panel and for the wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the
Awkward
invitation.
wave.
Bye.
Bye-bye, folks.
Dus ken je dat moment dat je in je agenda kijkt, want je vraagt je af,